Hello, and welcome to the June edition of Multimodal Mondays, which is hosted by MoveMe. My name is Sandra Phillips, and I'm the founder and CEO of MoveMe. We're an award-winning, women-owned boutique agency focused on shared mobility architecture, which essentially means the design, plan, building, and evaluation of shared mobility services. Doesn't matter whether it's micromobility, car sharing, or ultimately integrating the new mobility services with public transit. This month's topic is one of the top picks from our viewers, the physical co-location of shared mobility options with public transit, also often called mobility hubs, or, because we have Rebecca here, Mobilpunkt. And I'm delighted to have three speakers join us for this session with very different backgrounds. So we have Rebecca Karbaumer, Project Coordinator at the Department of Transport for the City of Bremen. She'll talk about the Mobilpunkt, I'm sure, a little bit more in a minute. We have Yuval Fogelson, urban designer focused on public space transformation, new mobility, and tactical urbanism. He recently finished his research at UBC, which is trying to straddle kind of the physical world with the virtual world. And he'll, I'm sure, talk about this in a second. And then we have Vlad Marica, head of sales with FluidTime, dialing in from Austria. FluidTime is one of the pioneers in mobility as a service, so the virtual world. And before I get into all the details, I get quite excited. I would like to kick this session off with each of you just giving a little bit of background of your work and how that ties or why mobility hubs are important. And Rebecca, maybe I start with you because you're doing brick and mortar stuff. So let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sandra, for the invitation. And the opportunity to be here. The brick and mortar stuff. So city of Bremen in northern Germany, we have been doing mobility hubs since 2003. So almost 20 years of mobility hubs. And at the time, there was neither a legal framework nor a precedent, especially in Europe, for mobility hubs in the public realm. And very early on, our focus was on car sharing as a solution for providing an alternative to individual car ownership and for helping us solve this major problem in the city that we have is too many cars in limited public space. So the mobility hubs are really an integral part of our spatial management strategy. And reclaiming that public street space for citizens and for people. And we do that by, as a municipality, by providing space for shared mobility services and car sharing in particular, drawing it into the public realm, drawing it into the public awareness, and increasing accessibility to shared cars and shared travel modes, and linking those to other sustainable modes of transport as one of those pillars of sustainable travel, right next to walking, cycling, public transport. Car sharing complements that, and we do that with our mobility hubs as well. In the meantime, we have 45 mobility hubs in the public realm, and that makes up only 1/3 of the entire car sharing offer in the city. So there are still stations and hubs on private property, but we as a municipality see our job and also an opportunity for closing gaps in the network with mobility hubs for providing service or bringing services closer to citizens in neighborhoods that are not serviced or underserviced at the moment. And as we said there, Sandra, you mentioned that we focus on the bricks and mortar. Obviously around mobility hubs, there's a lot of talk about digitization, digital integration, mobility as a service, and MaaS. And of course, things like the smartphone have been amazing and great for the advancement of shared mobility services. But in Bremen, we realize you can accomplish quite a lot by focusing on those low and no tech solutions. And especially you can accomplish a lot on very small budget, which is what we have in Bremen. So small budget, but high impact has allowed us to plan new mobility hubs in this public realm, and also not only address mobility issues, but also address accessibility issues in neighborhood, and also road safety and solve issues of drivability or maneuverability in these narrow, very congested European streets. Yeah, the dense urban network.
And that's really interesting. And I was going to go to Yuval, but now I actually changed my mind and I'm going to go to Vlad because you're essentially the flip side. And then Yuval, maybe you can tie the two together. So you're really in the
Sure.
virtual side
Sure.
with the offer that Fluid Time has. And so maybe give us a bit of background. I don't know that everybody knows who Fluid Time is. Maybe give us a bit
Sure. I'd love to.
of
So
background about that. And then how that, the flip side essentially of what Rebecca just said, the brick and mortar world, the
pretty
virtual
much,
world.
pretty much. And I think that there's a very, very good connection. So just to put the things a bit into perspective, Fluidhem has been around since about 2004. We've started working on integrated mobility in 2006, and since 2008 or 2009, we're operating, or we were operating the app for the public transport app for 5 of the 6 largest Austrian cities. In 2016, we heard of the concept mobility as a service, and we started looking into it, and we started building our own platform called Fluid Hub, which is a backend platform that connects to multiple transport service providers and basically fuses together their offerings into one single offering for the end user, which allows the end user, the traveler, to plan, book, and pay for his trips in an integrated way. On one side, we are only digital. So we are a digital mobility hub that deals with the bit of the fragmentation that you have right now in transportation or in urban transportation, with public transport, car sharing, e-scooters, every single mode of transport you can imagine. It's a lot of transport service providers on the landscape. And on the other hand, we do have projects where we do brick and mortar work as well, which are similar to what Rebecca's doing. There's this project that I'm going to talk about a bit later with a company called Goldbeck Parking Services. They're based in Germany. And together with them, we're turning parking lots, physical parking lots, into mobility hubs that not only combine mobility services, but also bring, let's say, societal services into the equation. So, for example, you can rent yourself power tools, or you can rent yourself a society room or whatever, if you want to do so.
So Yuval, your research with UBC is really focused at the intersection of the two. Like you looked
Right.
very specifically at the brick and mortar world. You did the research together with TransLink, and then also looked at the virtual and what can be done to enhance kind of those mobility hubs. And it's a huge paper. I'm still working my way through it. So maybe you'll give us kind of the Cliff Note version
Right.
of the research.
Right. So I'm actually from the physical world background. I'm an urban designer, and I used to work with master planning and kind of designing new neighborhoods and nation projects and a lot of things. Before moving to Canada and Brazil, I also worked kind of on public space transformations using tactical urbanism to change public spaces. And now through this research that I did at UBC TIPS Lab, that's the Transport Infrastructure and Public Space Lab, so together with TransLink's New Mobility Research Grant. So that kind of gave the focusing on transit, but the main topic of the research was originally curb space design and management. So that was the starting point, with curb space, and it wasn't the intention to end up kind of having a research which is about mobility hubs, but if you kind of follow the logic of what you can do with all the different curb spaces, it ended up being a kind of a proposal for mobility hubs in a way. So looking at all the different competing uses of curb space also ended up with the realization that there's a need for this, call it virtual curb space. And so that's how those two kind of came together. And because it was kind of focused on transit, so the whole idea of mobility hub is really kind of based around transit, whether it's a bus stop or a train station, and not just any place which has a few different modes. That's one of the main things. Um, and then the idea is that because you're building upon a transit system, that it's a mobility hub network within the city. That's, I think, the most important. So it's a mobility hub network in the whole city, which is interconnected virtually, but physically it's actually just transformation of very strategically selected curb space. Yeah. So I can talk more a bit later about the integration of the two.
I was just going to piggyback on that because I find that one of the other pieces I found really interesting in the work that you've done is you actually show a transition. You didn't just, we sometimes have this idea that we can just think about mobility hubs, pick a couple strategic locations, and now we have it. And you really looked at like, okay, it's a transition and it won't look the same today than it will look in, let's say, 20 years or so. I also think fully recognizing, that there's increasing competition for that curb space, right? There's more ride hailing, which is very controversial in BC, but there's also more delivery. And then we're in Vancouver, we still don't have micromobility kick scooters. We have a traditional bike share, but that's it. But they also are looking at the space. So there's increasing competition. Anyway, I know that you come from tactical urbanism, and I know long time ago, before the research was finished, you and I had a conversation around how tactical urbanism perhaps influenced also your look on this, on this transitional piece and how you get from like not having anything to something. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you think it takes to get to a full mobility hub?
Sure. Yeah, I think my experience with tactical urbanism really shaped the way I kind of looked at all of it. The research in itself is called Transitioning into New Mobility. So it really was, the focal point was the transition. Before I did this, so the head of the TIPS lab, Annalisa Mayboom, she wrote a book, The Driverless Urban Future, and it looks at kind of the current logic and the possible speculative future logic, right? And all the different ways that you could design a city for autonomous vehicles. But my biggest question was always, how do we get from today's logic to that logic? Like, what are the steps that you take? And through tactical urbanism, I think there's three main points. So one, it would be this idea of the phased approach, that it's never from just A to B or A to Z, let's say. It's always, you always have some steps on the way that you test and that you pilot, and then you concretize what works, and then you do that again and again in a way. So I think that really shaped kind of the whole framework. Like every single mobility hub component, I looked in those steps. And then I kind of realized that it's also the virtual and also the physical. So it was separated into these different steps, but for each step, both the virtual and physical. And what happens is that to update a physical space, it's a lengthy process. You need to plan, you need to design, you need to consult, you need to approve, construction, of course. So that could take like a year or two or more, depending on how, even if it's just a street design. But in the virtual world, you can update an app in a day, or you can do even an update of a system like within a few weeks or a month. So updating the virtual is much faster. So there's a big gap between the update speed. So what happened? So that's where kind of tactical urbanism came in. We saw during COVID, within a few months, the space was already changed. So you can, if you have a very organized kind of methodology in place, you can change the space on a weekly basis if you need to. And that's how the virtual and the physical kind of can play together with the help of tactical urbanism. And also the final thing, the third thing, is about dealing with uncertainty. So I think one of the main challenges of new mobility is cities are reluctant to introduce new modes or new ideas sometimes. And I think that tactical urbanism really helps with kind of dealing with this fear, with this anxiety of, oh, but if we do this, then what will happen? So it really kind of lowers the bar, and you can just test things and kind of really knowingly test things with the knowledge that, oh, then later it might go away. Not thinking of everything as permanent, thinking as the city as a constantly changing place.
If I can touch on that really quick, what I find really interesting is you were saying that cities are reluctant to change the physical world, and I find it really interesting that they're also reluctant to change the virtual world. I mean, you have the physical world, you have the virtual world overlapping. And at least with mobility as a service, the virtual world tries to take advantage of all the assets and all the geography that you have in order to get people to travel from A to B in an efficient way. But cities are reluctant to delve into the virtual world and even to give it a chance to try to make the physical world, which is lagging behind, to try to make it more efficient. To try to reshuffle the different possibilities for mobility to produce something better. And I'm happy that pattern is being broken slowly. It's being broken in Singapore. It's being broken in the Netherlands with the 7 national mass pilots, where the government has given money to both the physical and the virtual world to try to come up with something better.
Yeah, I wanted just to add, like, do you think this reluctancy is often it's because of lack of knowledge and just lack of experience rather than an actual kind of not wanting?
I think it's a mixture of tradition. Why change something that doesn't really work well, but we have it? Why risk making it worse? Despite the promises and slowly emerging positive impact of mobility as a service. And so I think it's a bit of tradition, and I think it's just a lot of thinking inside the box. I think there's very well. Sorry.
I was going to say, and I'm pretty sure Rebecca has something to say about that. Now, I will say, you guys were a pioneer, so you guys may have a bit of a different mindset, but you have been trying to also help other cities, right, to move towards that. So maybe you can say, from a city perspective, why is that?
Exactly. I just wanted to say, wait. Just in defense of cities. Speaking from a city who's not afraid to try something new, obviously, because we have been forerunners in the field of shared mobility policy, car sharing policy, and policies for e-scooters in Germany. I mean, there is kind of a reason. Obviously, you say reluctance. There is still some lack of knowledge about new technologies, but there's also a responsibility that cities have, and that is to work within legal framework, obviously, and to work, because we work with taxpayer money, to make sure we deal with that taxpayer money responsibly. In Bremen, so our efforts our focus is on, not because our finances are limited. I mean, Bremen's financial situation is less than rosy, as we say, as Germany. We have to be really careful about the choices we make and say, will this measure that we invest in our support help us in our sustainable transport goals? Is it most efficient? And obviously, we'd like to try out new things sometimes, but we have to really make sure. And something like mobility hubs and car sharing is, for us, low cost but high impact, is a huge impact, because we are able to free up, public street space. We're able to provide as alternatives to the private car, and so while not being able to subsidize those services, we can promote through public awareness work, maybe providing space, and policies in our housing development strategy that allow the integration of shared mobility services. So it's always for us. Is it something efficient? Is it going to be around long term? Does it help us achieve our overall transport goals? And I mean, Bremen was the first German city with an entirely cycling zone. We kind of coerced or forced our federal government to create a policy and signage for cycling zones, which didn't exist at the time. But it was also fairly low budget, high impact measure, also a non-digital measure, if I might say, that was super effective. But yeah, cost benefit is something we always have to juggle, and I think other municipalities obviously also have to think of that. But I certainly agree with you. There are some municipalities who are very reluctant to new things or new to change. Yeah.
And I was going to say, I think this ties into kind of the underlying theme of this Multimodal Monday series is like trying to understand behavior change and how do we actually get people to change into these shared mobility services. And the city of Vancouver is overhauling their parking policy right now. And it's probably like it's the biggest overhaul since I've been here. I think it's the biggest overhaul for a long time. And there's a whole public engagement thing going on because curb space, for whatever reason, for your car is like this holy grail. You do not touch it. And if there's, like, I remember when we launched Car2Go, and this, like, luckily the city was in favor of Car2Go. So they dealt with all the complaints. But there was a flood of complaints because now there was a very visible little car that had a branded logo, all of a sudden taking up resident space. People not realizing that it's their neighbor who actually doesn't have a car. Using that service. So there's something really, like, I think psychologically interesting going on in people's minds. So I do want to talk a little bit about this. How do we do this behavior change, and how do the tools that you use, Yuval, tactical urbanism, kind of this like collocation of the digital and the physical for mobility hubs, Rebecca with your Mobilpunkt, and then Vlad with the work you're doing with Goldbeck. How do we get people to change behavior? And are these multimodal hubs a good way? Rebecca, maybe I'll start with you because you made a little comment around impact, high impact. And I'm like, let me piggyback on that.
High impact, yeah. I mean, we all know that daily transport decisions are not made by, financial means. We don't think, what's it going to cost me to get from A to B, and then choose the appropriate mode of transport. We also don't think about, greenhouse gas emissions and then make a mobility choice. Everybody, if you ask somebody, are environmental factors important to you? They say, yeah, of course, but they don't drive our daily decisions. What drives our daily decisions is convenience. Can we get from A to B as fast and as conveniently as possible? Can we meet our daily transport needs as fast and as conveniently as possible? So, I mean, the mobility hubs play a role in providing freedom of choice for citizens, and that freedom of choice and that flexibility to use the transport mode that best suits their mobility and net need at the moment, making it attractive, easily accessible, short distances to the next mobility hub, short distances to the next service, is essential for changing that travel behavior. I mean, I lived in North America for quite a long time in the Midwest. And I had no other option except for the automobile. So, there was no way for me to change my behavior, even though I really wanted to at that time. And then, when I moved into city center and I was able to be, a bit more ideological about my travel modes, I knew this works for me, but it doesn't work for people with, a family or kids or jobs in entirely different places. So, it's one of my reasons for coming or choosing my career path here is because I enjoy that freedom of choice myself here in Europe, and I want to give others that option.
So freedom of choice is one thing. The other thing I kind of heard underneath this all, and this is I think maybe perfect for Vlad, is like it's removing friction ultimately. It's like making it seamless in the sense of like from a user perspective, there's this little friction and this little brain power required to get, through those different modes. With that, I mean, that's obviously, at least in my mind, that's obviously something that Mass does really well, right? And the digital world helps me use my phone to navigate. I don't know what you guys' experience has been, especially also with that Goldbeck thing. I'm really curious. With that project.
Sure. So you were breaking up for about 10 seconds. I'm not sure if you were directing the question at me, so I
Yes,
can.
I was like, so how do you, like, with that
Sure.
frictionless
Right.
virtual, what can you do on the mass side?
We found that making it as easy as possible for the travelers to consume mobility and to benefit from it is the way to go. It's what we can do and what we're doing right now, and it's proving to be really good. So again, what we're doing is we're putting multiple transportation modes into parking lots, and we're allowing the travelers to switch between them very easily. So we're bundling them together, and at the same time, we're bundling in the virtual world. We're bundling the tariffs and the mobility, the opportunities for mobility within one single app, and we're combining that with, let's say, incentives and loyalty programs, so that if you are good and if you want to do something good for the environment, then you're going to be rewarded as well with, let's say, a coffee or cake or whatever.
Is the Goldbeck project, like, I know you mentioned earlier, they're like parking lots. Are they like within residential? Like, essentially what I'm trying to understand is those mobility hubs and there's choices,
Yes.
are they available now for me as a resident, or is it
Yes, they
commercial?
are. I think they're available for you as a resident, and I think Rebecca touched on this a bit earlier. At least in Vienna, there's this new rule saying that if you build an apartment, then you also need to build a parking space for it. And the way, which is obviously pretty expensive, and the way we're kind of circumventing it with Goldbeck is to not provide a parking space, but provide a mobility account to everybody who buys a new apartment. And this mobility account is giving the residents access to multiple mobility modes. So not only parking, but also, let's say, e-scooters or bike sharing and so on and so forth. So they can choose the best mode that's needed for their journey.
Oh, very interesting. And that now kind of leads me back to Yuval, because the other thing I remember from your study is you had these, like, obviously you're an urban designer, so the visuals are like mind-blowing, but there's like, I remember there's a certain number of stations or multimodal hubs where you also then had like these digital kind of boards that, just like when you go to the train station,
Yeah.
and you have like, and now you know, okay, the closest bike is XYZ, right? So there's this almost like, it's still in the physical world, but it's digital, and you're really focused on public transit. So help me understand how that helps again with this behavior change, or the rationale behind that.
So yeah, what I tried to do is almost, I called it like the airportization of mobility in a way. But if you think about it, in an airport, everything is like you kind of, it's kind of designed for everyone, and you just you kind of have to follow. There's wayfinding. There's everything is. It's also in a train station, but in an airport, it's almost like a closed system that everything was thought of. So if you start redesigning where there's major bus stops, for example, and around that, look at like 100 meters around that to each direction, and then start designing around the bus directly next to it, have the option of taking a bike or e-scooter, and like have a public plaza, and then next to that somewhere a ride hail or kind of a pickup drop-off zone, and further away a car share, and kind of build around that where the bus stop is kind of the center. That already creates that integration which you kind of have in a mass app. You have it physically, but there's also this kind of idea of wayfinding, which is very strong, where each of these modes are considered part of this mobility hub, even if they're, some of them are private, some are public, they're separate. And the totem that you were talking about, it has a few, so it also has kind of an identifying, a kind of a placemaking element to it. So you kind of create an identity to a specific, even a normal intersection can be turned into a plaza where there's a bus stop, and that can have an identity. So the totem helps with the identity and kind of with the naming, the branding of a certain intersection. which I think maybe the Mobilpunkt also does in a smaller kind of scale. But also it allows you to, if you don't have a mobile phone, you can physically check in or buy a ticket like you do in a train station. But if you have that in every single one of these places, that means you can not only buy a ticket for the bus or the light rail or whatever, but also for ride hail or car share, or not really a ticket, but you could do it without a mobile phone. And I think like we often talk about equity and people that don't have mobile phones, but it's maybe in the future, like mobile phones are going to be they already are so accessible that it's also sometimes a choice of some people not to have a phone, or like we have to consider the other options. So I think like in a train station, you don't have you can get everything there if you want to, but on a bus, no. Like some places, if you don't have your card, you can't enter a bus in some cities. So that's kind of a barrier for behavior. So I think removing all these things, making everything visually connected, you get off the bus, you see everything. I think those are the things that you can treat with design.
But
I
you
think
also,
just to make a really short point, I think it's worth exploring the relationship between the physical and the virtual world. And I think that this relationship should be not one of competition, but it should be one of collaboration. If you have a mobile phone, then it should be easy for you to plan in advance all your trips around the totem. And if you don't happen to have a mobile phone, then you should be served at the totem nonetheless in a very equitable way.
Yeah, it's so refreshing not to be the only person to say that, Yuval. I would say, the supplement, the digital should always, or the digital and the phone should always be a supplement to the analog. I mean, I think we've all, if you go to a new city, it's not you whip out your phone, but you look, we still find that the physical wayfinding is more effective and used much more often than the digital. And especially for those people who cannot afford a phone, or who do not want to. I mean, I think we have to consider still part of our society of who doesn't want to lead an entirely digital lifestyle. And even if you do want to, who hasn't had that situation where you've been on the go and your phone has died and you have no way to charge it, and all of a sudden you're completely lost. I'm so glad I can still open my car share vehicle with my membership card, or I can still pay for my transit pass with another card. So just, I think we always have to still have all of those options is essential, because in the end we would end up excluding at least some part of society.
I wanted just to add, so another thing that I thought was, for example, in the pickup drop-off zone, it's a pickup drop-off zone. It's not a Uber station or a Lyft station. So it's kind of also debranding the brands, so that, for example, Car2Go came and then it left Vancouver. So like you have a specific area for car share, and any company can come and go. So it kind of also helps the companies, like even small companies that have like a more niche market, they can still plug into, like, they know every mobility hub has like 5 places for car share or something of that kind. So I think that also helps kind of the just dedicating space for pickup, drop off, dedicating space for car share, regardless of the company involved. And I think that helps helps new companies enter the game.
And I think that analogous to the physical world, I think the mobility world should be just the same. Because in the physical world, you have, let's say, Uber and Lyft, you have 2 competitors, and I think that there will be no single virtual MaaS provider that's the biggest and best and so on and so forth. And that begs the question of interoperability, both in the virtual world and the physical world. So maybe a good example for that is roaming with your mobile phone. You can get service if you're in 2 different states in the United States, for example, from 2 different providers. And I think that soon there will be a necessity for that as well, both in the physical and in the virtual world.
And I was gonna say this, and maybe this is kind of the wrap up, but what that ultimately to me sounds like, public transit and I'm using Vancouver because I obviously know it very well, but here is set up underneath TransLink. There's I don't know, maybe not a dozen, but a handful of different providers. And me as a user, I have absolutely no idea. And it also doesn't matter to me that Coast Mountain Bus operates this bus, and then, West Vancouver Bus Company operates that, but it doesn't matter to me. I just need to get from, downtown to over to West Vancouver. So what you guys are describing to me is essentially that potentially will happen with new mobility, and that if you have these physical hubs, that's one way of starting that. The other thing, Yuval, and I'm going to pick up on that because that was kind of a side remark, and I'm like, that's really interesting, because you physically co-located public transit, active transportation close, and then you started moving car share and then ride hail. So talking about making it convenient, you made it less convenient for things that maybe you don't want as much. So physically, you have to walk further, right? And it's still close enough that if I need to, because I can't use a bike, then I don't. But for Sandra that can use a bike and just wants to get quickly somewhere, the bike is the first thing I see. So it primes me every time that the bike is probably what I should get on, or the kick scooter, whatever it is, micromobility option. So I thought that was really interesting, also this kind of tiny little tweak on changing and nudging, not with incentives, just physically making me walk further.
Right.
So I know we have we're at 9:15, which means
Okay.
we're essentially up on our time. So if you each have a last word, where would you like these mobility hubs to be in the next, let's say 3 to 4 years? What needs to happen so this is really becoming mainstream?
So for us in Bremen, we have short and medium term goals where we want our mobility hubs to go, and then long term goals. And this is not one that has been politically sanctioned, but it is my own personal goal. So in this frame, I might as well just say it. So we have the goal of having mobility hubs every 300 meters. Every 300 meters, so that if services are no longer available, and talking specifically about the car share services, if they're fully booked, a resident has less than a 5-minute walk to the next hub. Shared mobility services are only really attractive, especially as an alternative to private car ownership, which is also our main priority. They're only really attractive if they're easily accessible. You have alternatives really close by. So, we're working on network expansion. Of course, that does take time. And because each one is also an individual plan. I mean, there's no one size fits all. We always plan the mobility hubs to meet the needs of that very specific neighborhood. So that does take a process, especially political and citizen participation. But our goal is, maximum of 300 meters between each hubs, and to stop the growth of cars and car ownership in the city. Long-term goal is obviously to use those mobility hubs to reduce the number of cars in the city and to reclaim that public street space entirely. And sort of my vision for the future, for 10, 15, 20 years down the line is no more on-street parking for private cars. Private cars are moved, in the private realm, in the background, and only to have mobility hubs and those shared travel modes with a public added value in the public realm. And then we have entirely different quality of space and quality of place and accessibility in our neighborhoods.
Ambitious, but I like it.
Yeah.
A lot.
I would also play around with the target groups, because I think we're talking a lot about normal travelers, you and I, but looking at environmental goals, I think that a lot of companies are struggling to meet their environmental goals as well in times where they provide a lot of company cars to the users. So what I would like to see, and let's see if I can get this sentence right, because it's going to be complex. I would like to see both B2C, so I would like to see both normal users, normal travelers, and business travelers having access to mobility hubs through both a physical incentive. The mobility hub is very close to us, and a virtual incentive that I have an app that I can structure my mobility with, and I can play around with my mobility with, regardless of whether I'm traveling for private or for business purposes. So I would like to see, to put it shortly, I would like to see an integration of both private and business travel, using mobility hubs, both physically and virtually. I would like to see that.
That's going to be an interesting challenge. That's going to be an interesting challenge because the business is often, at least at the company, it's off the street. And so how do you get those guys or companies to change the behavior? It's really interesting. It's a very interesting thought. Yuval, you have the last word.
Right.
Give us your view.
So one thing I've noticed is that there's first of all, we need a clear definition of what is a mobility hub, kind of maybe a standardization, kind of a general understanding of what they are. Like I hear Rebecca saying every 300 meters, and Vlad, it's in a parking garage, and I'm like focusing as if it's like subway stations across the city. So there's a kind of everyone has a different vision of what a mobility hub is. And in my work, I look a lot about mobility hub typologies. So I think in the short term, it's more kind of getting a more understanding that everyone is talking the same language. And of course, in the short term, to do actual piloting, testing and piloting in the physical and in the virtual, so that in 5 years' time, it's possible to concretize and kind of build what has been tested. That's what I would say.
I've got a definition
All
for
right.
Sorry. In the Shanrock project, so it's an EU project I coordinate. My Belgian partners have come up with a definition, and it's quite simple, and it's one that I am definitely d'accord with. It's a mobility hub is a transport hub on neighborhood level for us in the project that combines shared and sustainable modes of transport for an added public value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one of
there's like optional items but also like essential building blocks. A mobility hub, like you said, can be a lot of different things. It can be a regional railway hub. I mean, that's nothing new. It can be a transport interchange in the city. All those things by definition are mobility hubs. But in the Shanrock project, we've defined a mobility hub as on neighborhood level, short distances to where the journey originates, not where it ends. And it incorporates those shared travel modes, and it's one that we've been trying to promote for a long time because we've been seeing so many different definitions of mobility hubs.
Yeah, I would see that as as one of the typologies, like a neighborhood mobility hub, I would call it, as opposed to other mobility hubs.